Welcome back to the Watch List. I'm Nicole Petalides. Welcome in Ted Thatcher, president of Bright Lake Wealth Management. And we are looking at the big picture. Today we heard, we're following the big, beautiful bill, right, which has made it through part of Congress, but not all of Congress. At the same time, of course, you had Elon Musk today out saying that it's sort of counterintuitive to the work that Doge has been doing. That being said, what are your thoughts on the bill, and are there bright spots within it? The tax cuts would be a bright spot, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Nicole. I think, we could look at this bill through those two lenses. What does it give us, and then what doesn't it contain? And I think to Elon's point, we should look at what it doesn't give us. But first, it does codify the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. A lot of people were pretty concerned that we might not see that, fully pass through and we'd see all these big tax hikes. We're not going to see that. I think most people are pretty excited about that. We saw, of course, consumer confidence come in really way over expectations. I think that could contribute to that. And obviously the light at the end of the tunnel we're seeing with tariffs there. It also delivered on some other campaign promises, the no tax on tips. It's giving an increase in standard deduction for seniors. They are removing some of the incentives around electric vehicles. But when we zoom out a little further, I do look at what the bill doesn't give us. Because the tax cuts are being codified, the CBO is estimating a deficit of $4 trillion almost that's going to cause. And we've seen the credit markets, especially in the 30-year Treasury, spike up to essentially that 5 handle, telling, I think the politicians in D.C., we don't like this. And I do think that that's quite interesting, given the amount of emphasis that has been placed by this administration on initiatives like Doge, and to see none of those cuts, made permanent or really, established, I think is an issue the markets are taking. And so the question we're asking now is, okay, well, how are we going to manage the fiscal situation that the U.S. is in if we aren't going to see the spending cuts?
Okay. And so that's the question. We don't know whether or not this passes through. There's always folks that are going through this with a fine-tooth comb. Overall, do you feel like the economy is in a pretty good place? Our economic health, do you think the Fed should be doing anything right now?
Sure, we can absolutely point to the Fed. I think Jerome Powell's comments, I think he's very much taken a wait and see approach. A lot of the projections don't estimate much moves on rate cuts, at least for the next 2 meetings. The probabilities have come down substantially. Is the economy in a reasonably good place? If you look at the labor numbers, they would tell you, there's labor demand, unemployment's still low. I think things are okay for sure. But I think in terms of, addressing the financial situation of the country, to get to the, result of, okay, we have this deficit problem, where do we go from here? I think a lot of us are saying, okay, well, there's kind of two paths here. Either there has to be the political will in DC, I think really on both sides of the aisle, to solve this issue, which doesn't exist right now, clearly, or we need to grow our way out of it. And if we're going to look at that potential alternative, I just don't think that we can have a conversation about that being a real possibility without discussing AI and the productivity that can come from it in terms of its ultimate economic consequences. And so when we talk about AI, of course, we could talk about the big names in big tech, which are, worth discussing. But what is going to fuel that in our AI race against China is energy, and that the incentives to really push the entrepreneurial envelope in energy development against China is also lacking in this bill. Today, the U.S. can produce about 1 trillion watts, expected to go up to about 2 trillion watts of energy in the next 15 years. Today, China is producing about 3 trillion watts, going up to 8 projected over the next 15 years. That is a huge factor in this AI race that I think, whether it's in this bill or some, adaptations that could happen in the Senate or by another bill, that we are going to have to emphasize in order to compete well.
Right. Understood. I want to talk more about tech. Actually, Jensen Huang noted that 50% of the AI skilled workers are actually Chinese. I mean, that we have a problem here at home, that we need to spend more on developing our AI skill set from young folks early on, et cetera. So tell me about the role of big tech here, names like Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, how those can and will propel us forward. I mean, it sounds like you're more positive than negative. You're probably believer in these stocks. Most people have been hot on these stocks over the long term. They've been very good. I know they're off the highs, but they've been very good over the long term. Your thoughts on Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA? Where do they fit into the big picture?
So I think to that point about energy, ultimately, I think that initiative has not taken place yet. And so we'll keep an eye out for opportunities in that zone. But right now, if we're going to say the way we grow out of this is AI, we're going to look at those big tech names. Google's at the top of my list here, at least from a price to earnings ratio. Google's trading around 18 times earnings. If you look at that compared to the other mega caps, it's like at a huge discount. And I understand, we've had these concerns about whether Gemini versus Chat GPT usage is, competitive or not. But we have to remember, look at, Google's revenue, look at what happened out of their earnings calls. Even their Blue Link search revenue was up 10%. And then you look at Google more broadly, they have 270 million users, paid subscribers, between their YouTube platform and their Google One, platforms. And so when you look at that level of user control that Google has, and then you compare that with everything that they just announced at I/O with all these, essentially AI apps, some of them agentic, some of them are AI mode with Google search. I think Google is going to be able to absolutely cram down Gemini through those, users' throats, essentially, and absolutely compete with, the Chat GPT, user growth that they've experienced. When you look at, especially that price to earnings ratio compared to the other mega caps, I really like it. And of course, they have, some of the brightest minds in the world at Google. And that is to say nothing about the other ways you could value the company. They, of course, have Waymo ownership. They own the whole thing, which I think Sundar maybe had only mentioned for the first time at this earnings call. They own 10% of SpaceX. And of course, that is to say nothing of everything the market's focused on today with NVIDIA. NVIDIA's earnings are coming out. Obviously, given the discussion around, the regulatory environment with the Chinese exports of their chips, I think that NVIDIA is going to be a little bit rocky here. Hopefully they come in right at expectations and are able to, kind of weather that storm. I do personally expect a little bit of volatility with NVIDIA at this point, but still, they are the premier name when it comes to chips and processing around AI. And so ultimately, I'm a big believer in it. And then finally on Microsoft, obviously they have a stake in OpenAI.
All right, so a big believer in NVIDIA, even if it's a rocky road right now this week when we get the information. Thank you, Ted Thatcher, President of Bright Lake Wealth Management. Good to see you, Ted. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.